There are too many people out there who don't understand that they're losing money every time they do something. Profit is more important than growth. It doesn't help me to double the size of my fleet if I'm losing, a little bit on every single load.
Welcome to this week's episode of Behind the Freight. I'm Todd Waldron, joined with my usual co-host, John Howland. And on today's episode, we have a very special guest, a good dear friend of myself and also Truckstop.com. We're joined by Mr. Avery Vise, VP of Trucking at FTR Transportation Intelligence, one of today's leading analysts in the trucking industry. Avery spent many years studying freight markets, capacity trends, and the forces shaping today's trucking environment. He's also the author of FTR's Trucking Update Reports and host of the Trucking Market Update podcast. Today, we're going to talk about marketing data. We're going to talk about some background on Avery and FTR and the relationship with Truckstop. And we're going to try to clear up some common misconceptions and things we see around rates, but also most importantly, get Avery's perspective on a lot of things happening and shaping up in the industry today and the things he's seen along the way. So Avery, thank you for joining us. It's great to have you.
All right. Well, thanks, Todd and John.
I think too, Todd, to kind of piggyback on that and what Todd had just said is Avery is the wizard. So this is going to be fun. So Avery, we really appreciate you being on.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So for listeners, meeting you for the first time on today's episode, Avery, how do you describe what you do in the trucking industry?
So what do I do? Well, I mean, I call myself an analyst, really. And what that essentially means is I spend all day just looking at data, reading, talking to people in the industry to kind of just sort of come together with a narrative of what's going on and what is likely to happen. So, I'm different than, a lot of the people who focus, on sort of day trading and trucking is what I would call it, which is, what is my best tactical move today? What is my best tactical move in the next half day, or even this week? I mean, our horizon is really more in quarters and years than it is in even months, let alone, so our role really is to kind of assimilate these larger economic trends. We do convert that into an actual, forecast for volume and as well as capacity and rates. But it's to really understand where things are going and where we'll be a year from now as opposed to where we're going to be, tomorrow. And that's kind of my job is to look at the data that we're generating out of FTR, look at, obviously the spot market data, and especially the general economic data, and to kind of make sense of that in a way that is relevant to, brokers, carriers, and shippers.
That is amazing. And I know you've been around for a long time in this industry. I'm curious, what was it that originally drew you into transportation?
Well, it's, I think of the way a lot of people end up wherever they end up is kind of happenstance. Right out of college, I got a job. It was like 25 hours a week as a editorial assistant at a airline industry publication. And that turned in within a couple of years to a full-time job, which at the time was a dream job for me, which was a congressional editor of a publication called Aviation Daily. So I was covering Congress regarding things having to do with commercial airlines, commercial aircraft, airports, and so on. And I also was editing an airport newsletter. And I did that for about, 12, 13 years. For family reasons, my wife and I wanted to come back to Alabama. And when we did so, I just happened to have an opportunity pop up in Tuscaloosa, Alabama, which actually is where I went to high school, and ended up at a company at the time called Ramble Publishing and launching a small fleet publication. And in fact, I'm sure many of your audience will know Brent Hutto, who I worked with from the very beginning there, and we actually worked together for about 15 years. So it was kind of a happenstance. I ended up in the airline sector, and then sort of just because of availability, ended up making the move in trucking. what, 28 years ago, something like that. That's wow. Anyway.
Where does time go?
Amazing.
My question is, how did you survive 15 years working with Brent Hutto? Give us some
it was
tips.
not easy. I mean, literally, there were a couple of times where it was not easy. There was one particular situation I won't go into detail, but he was a good salesman, and he would sell things that were difficult to actually accomplish, and one of them I had to deal with. So, but I really enjoyed working with him all those years, and of course, FTR has been working with transport with Truckstop.com since even before I joined FTR, and so I had been working with Brent for almost all of my career, really, except for a very short period of time.
That's awesome. Yeah, he really is great. Was it, hearing that story and hearing the background and things you've went through, wondering if there's like an early moment or a role that really shaped how you think about the industry, or that stands out as something as it was memorable about how your perspective and perception of the industry.
There's one thing that, and this was more than 25 years ago, because it was in the first publication that we launched back in 1998 called Trucking Company Magazine, and it eventually got absorbed into Commercial Carrier Journal. But we had a page in the very back of the magazine that said, it was a question, and we got responses every month. And the question was, what do you look for in drivers? And the response was, they have to be able to breathe. And the reason that hit me, and maybe not initially, I mean, obviously the guy was joking to some degree, but what it did eventually instill upon me over a period of time is that in trucking, in a large part, your success is tied to the performance of your dumbest competitor. And it's such a large industry, and if you are competing against a lot of stupid people, with low standards or whatever, it can hurt you. And that's probably not the takeaway I took from it initially. But over time, it's like, that's really what that means to me is it's really just you're only as good as your lowest common denominator. And I think it's an important point that I think informs how I think about my own job, and how, maybe not so much how FTR itself thinks, but certainly how I approach my own job.
Yeah, awesome nugget there for sure. So you've been both on the journalism side as well as on the market intelligence side of things. How did that transition from journalism into kind of the data and the market intelligence, how does it shape the way you approach the trucking industry today?
Sure. So, in a lot of ways, it is the same discipline, as long as it's being done for the right reason. If your job is to be analytical and to inform people and not just get clicks on the website, I guess I had the good fortune of starting my career in journalism before there was an internet, and people actually read large passages and things like that. But I always viewed my job as trying to illuminate and find what's different and what is changing. I mean, when there's talk of a driver shortage, or fuel prices are high or whatever, that the day that happens, it's news. The next day, it's not. The next day, it's what's new. How much deeper can we dig? And it's the same discipline, really, when you're talking about being an analyst. And so that transaction actually was happening while I was still a journalist, because I spent much of my time when I was the chief editor of Commercial Carrier Journal, writing on the economic side, and eventually, actually, before I even left the company, I had transitioned into a essentially market intelligence role. So it was pretty seamless, but I think in a large degree, they should be very similar disciplines. I don't think they always are, but I think they should be.
Yeah. Very true. It's an interesting take, and just an interesting combination of different industries, and the way that you're able to kind of position and merge them together is pretty cool. What's one misunderstanding that you've seen people outside of the industry then often have about trucking?
Misunderstood. There's one that I probably had myself. I think I did, but it's been, like I said, 28 years. I came from the airline industry. Airline industry, of course, seems very complicated, and all this technology and everything. And my thought was, well, trucking is going to be real easy. It's just moving stuff from point A to point B. And, yes, an element of that is that, I mean, most of what a driver, an actual driver deals with is that, correct? But the broad industry as at least as complicated, in fact, more complicated than the passenger airline industry. And the reason is that, there are only so many airports, right? You only have, I don't know, I used to know the number of airports and I used to know all their airport codes, but, you only have so many airports. There's only so many, city pairs, that ain't true in transportation. And of course, the logistics side of it, making sure that things are where they're supposed to be when they're there. So I think the biggest misconception people have is, oh, you just get in a truck and you go somewhere and you unload it. And it's like, no, it's way more than that.
Yeah.
Way more than that. Totally agree. Yeah.
That's fascinating.
The industry is way more complex than really the average person gives it credit for. So a good call. So I'm going to switch gears a little bit. We all know Truckstop.com obviously works with you and the FTR team. We come up with our spot market insights, that tool there. I'm curious. So for those listeners who don't know what the spot market index or insights is, can you give us just a brief description of the spot market insights?
Sure. Well, I mean, at the highest level, it is, once a week, taking all of the data that occurs, 24/7 within the Truckstop.com system and making some sense of it. And it's, frankly, the part that I'm directly involved with is pretty broad, right? I'm looking at it at the national level and to some degree the regional level, if there seems to be some differences. And looking at with a big focus on rates, because in my mind that's kind of where the rubber hits the road, and also in volume, and just sort of like giving kind of a sense of why this is happening. Because again, this goes back to FDR. Almost everything I do has sort of a quarterly or an annual sort of horizon, and actually Spot Market Insights is the sort of the exception to that. But I still try to bring some of that sort of why is this happening to that. But beyond that, that's all well and good. But something that we launched actually with Truckstop.com back in the fall was even more granular data at a regional level that goes, even more sliced and diced than what I cover, and looking at it not only by equipment type, but also whether we're talking about full truckload or partial truckload or LTL or what have you. And that allows the user to then go in and, essentially customize. I mean, that may be a little highfalutin for it, but essentially, okay, here's the region I'm interested in, and, here's the equipment type and so on, and kind of play around with, okay, where are rates doing better than what I'm getting now? And start to think through, okay, maybe I need to start, going a different direction every week when I get in my truck, instead of going, northeast, maybe I need to go northwest or whatever. So, it's still fairly broad. I mean, we don't get into that, nitty gritty, lane stuff as part of that. I mean, there are other avenues for that within, truckstop.com, but that's not what Spot Market Insights is. It's really more of a try to assimilate all of it and have some kind of a good solid understanding as to how the market is performing.
Very good. For me, it's been just, super informative throughout my career. Now, being at Truckstop for over a year, but had the pleasure of working with you and the FTR team, and just deepening my understanding of what you do, what we do, and how they together are a pretty powerful tool. But in my time as a broker, as leading carriers and things like that, I would always struggle with trying to understand all these different data I'm looking at. How do they one, what are they telling me? And then two, how do I apply what they're telling me to my operations or my business? And so I've always liked to put them in their place and understand how different data points align with what I'm doing in my business and identify that, so then I can directionally see how I can learn from the changes and things like that. But from your perspective, do you have any advice or thoughts for carriers or brokers on how they should interpret what they're seeing in spot market insights properly?
Sure. The one thing we don't do in spot market insights, although I kind of talk about, in fact, I don't just kind of talk through it. I spend a lot of time talking through it, is seasonally adjust the data, right? I mean, we're presenting the data, as, we're talking about rates. It's the all-in broker posted rate as it is. It's the load index as it is, and so on. Now we plot that against a 5-year average, so that gives you a little bit of a sense. Although, the 5-year average for the last 5 years has been pretty, screwed up. So it's kind of hard to say what's normal. But where I'm going with this is that I think the biggest thing people need to understand is seasonality. And I think truckers do understand it, but I don't think they always think about it thoroughly. And an example of that is that we always see this increase in applications for authority around February. There's always this little spike in applications for operating authority. And at first I'm mystified. It's like, why is that happening every year? And it's because of what happens to rates in late December, right? Rates always go through the roof in late December. And I think a lot of people look at that, look at those rates, the market's turning, and so I think it's understanding that rates always go up in the second half of December. They always go up in the, late June. They're always going to be a little stressed around Thanksgiving, especially in refrigerated. So I think the biggest thing is don't look at what happened week over week. It's really what is happening, not only year over year, because even that, you have to see what happened last year, right? You have to, year over year is great, except, last year tanked. So that year over year number doesn't mean much. But you really just have to think through it. And again, I try to point those points out, especially like in the wintertime. He's like, okay, this was like a really good week year over year, but guess what? There was a problem last year or whatever. So I think that's the biggest thing. I think savvy people generally pick up on that, but I think especially newer participants in the market, it takes them a while to sort of get the hang of that.
Agreed. Yeah. You covered a lot there. That was really good. I'm curious, from your perspective, smaller carriers out there, what should they be paying attention to in the spot market trends that are most often kind of overlooked or misunderstood?
Sure. To be honest, I tend to focus on just simply what's happening with rates in that equipment type. And I think a lot of time people look at loads, and, loads a lot of time is really just they're just things that pop up that cause a shift from contract into spot, don't necessarily mean a lot in terms of rates. And I think the smart carriers just really need to be especially focused on the rate side of it. And we do post really the all-in broker rate, but obviously they need to take what fuel's doing into account as well. But that's how I approach it, as a non-operator as well. But you do have to take volume into account, because if you only look at rates, turns out there might have only been 3 loads at that rate. So, it is a combination of stuff. It's a very holistic sort of pursuit. It's like, okay, rate is important, but rates only mean something if, there's a lot of it. Now, the good thing about the way we produce the data and spot market insights, jointly with Truckstop.com, is, when we're looking at the broad numbers, we're weighting all that, right? We're, a huge rate with only 5 loads is not going to make any difference. You could have a $10 rate, but if there's only 5 loads, so what? And it's not going to show up. It's not going to mean anything in the overall. So that's why, don't get focused. We tend to avoid getting too granular for that reason, because the granularity is great if you happen to be in a position to take advantage of that granularity. if you're in refrigerated and you're, reasonably close to Florida, knowing what flowers are doing is important. But, if you're not, so what? And to be honest, that's, at least at FDR, our role is not so much to find all those, little pearls, it's really to tell what the overall market's doing.
Yeah, it's such a challenge with so many components to the data, right? Your rate per miles, but then the number of miles might vary depending on destination, and then you have length of haul, or you have the line haul, and is it with fuel, without fuel, to the broker, to the shipper, to the carrier? It's like just in the rate and pricing data. So I love that perspective on making sure you zoom out and understand the various components. And I think for small carriers too, like being able to realize and recognize that this is not giving you verbatim rate per mile data, it's giving you directional reference or relevance to what you might be seeing in your rate. So it's an indicator and a supporter, but not a necessary verbatim to what you should be going out and expecting and or quoting or expecting to see. But when we zoom out and like look at and add even more chaos to what we're trying to understand and add additional data points to what's happening in the industry, what are key indicators that you personally watch when trying to understand where the market is heading then? So like we talked about what's included in your typical spot market insights, but outside of that, what are some of those key indicators?
Well, in our Freightcast forecasting model, we're looking at hundreds of them, but really to look at the broad data and to try to understand it personally without having to run it through a complicated econometric model, I would say the three things that I look at most are, manufacturing output, especially excluding high tech, because, high tech is not going to produce a whole lot of freight. So you can get that metric. Looking at consumer spending on goods, but that's been kind of complicated in the last couple of years. But it's a good overall barometer. And then, housing starts and existing home sales, especially if you're, a flatbed operator or broker, or especially existing home sales are very meaningful for dry van as well. So those are kind of the key ones that I tend to pay most attention to. There's a whole bunch of others, and a lot of people like to focus on inventories to sales ratios, but that one has become less meaningful, I think, in the last few years because they're just perpetually lean and it doesn't really mean much. But overall, I mean, manufacturing, except for that really short, heavy haul sector of the industry, dump truck, that kind of thing, manufacturing is what drives trucking. And so, where manufacturing goes is where trucking goes. And that has been the case, unfortunately for carriers, for the last 3 years. A lot of people like to talk about capacity, and capacity clearly is a big issue, but, it's also just a sluggishness up until recently in the manufacturing sector.
It's not, I mean, it's the interesting thing is I hear you talk is it's not an easy answer. And like almost every index you mentioned, there's a, except, but, or a but, and
that's why people like me exist, right?
Exactly.
I mean,
that's the chaos.
If you could reduce it to 4 metrics, then why would you need FTR, right? And that's kind of the point is that, we believe that you need to broaden your horizons and every day in our Slack channel, we're posting to each other. I don't know how many, probably a couple of dozen things every day. Like so-and-so was saying this, and then we end up having a debate over whether that actually means anything. And, our just a video feed of our Slack channel would probably be, something we could monetize. So.
Well, I also feel like that vein epitomizes transportation too. Common people outside the industry are like, "Can't you just do this?" And you're like, "Well, yeah, but or except." It's like there's always exceptions. Anyways,
Yeah, and I was accused a couple of years ago of being the king of the disclaimer. And,
I can see that,
so
Avery. After knowing you for a while, I can see
yeah,
that.
unlike my predecessor Noel Perry, who very much is not that. But I don't. At first I took offense at that, but then I also am like, well, as long as I present it all to you, right? What's the problem with that? My job is to really tell you how I see things. And sometimes it's not going to all be in one direction. In fact, it's usually not. It's usually there's caveats, and those caveats matter because sometimes they're geographical. Usually not. It's usually more, flatbed's going to do really well and nobody else is, or something like that. It's the other big misconception, going back to the simplicity thing, is the idea that trucking is one thing. It's like people come to us and they want to benchmark. It's like, well, we really appreciate your dry van, contract data, but what we really want is, multiple stop and this and this and this. And I'm like, you're not going to get that. Then the level you're looking for is not going to be available to you, at least not without the kind of investment that's far beyond what you're going to spend with us. Because that kind of granularity, number one, you're getting closer and closer and closer, but you have to live with certain broad metrics, I think, to kind of understand things. And then you can drill down, right? You can say, okay, well, this is what, dry van is doing overall, but, we have a little bit of higher service or whatever, and we can kind of adjust for that. So it's always, it's a cliche to say it's more of an art than a science. And especially for somebody, who works for a company that is supposed to be making this a science, it's just not total. It is a very nuanced and kind of complicated thing.
All right. So your perspective, very interesting. I'm curious what your thoughts are for those smaller carriers, owner operators, small fleets. What signals do you think they should be looking or paying attention to in the coming months?
So, the spot market is not the freight market. However, I think the smaller you are, the much more relevant it is as a signal. Number one, I mean, a lot of them are operating in the spot market but I think also, the reality is that an owner operator is not going to pay us probably what a subscription to our products costs, and so they need to look at something they can digest. We're making spot market insights available at no cost, really as a service to the industry. If you want to dig deeper than that, I'm sure that there are people at truckstop.com or FTR that they can talk to. But so we're providing a lot of resources, and other people do. And I think really, the broad indicators that I mentioned, I mean, definitely if you can keep up with, whatever's most relevant to your type of haul. If you're a flatbed, definitely be looking at what overall manufacturing is doing, and if you can see what manufactured of fabricated metal products or primary metal products are, that would be very useful to see, is that trending up or trending down. In refrigerated, it's much more obviously tied to agriculture and food, and there's metrics there as well from the Census Bureau and the Bureau of Economic Analysis. So if you have the time, there's definitely stuff that people can look at. But broadly speaking, and to simplify it, it's really what is going on with the equipment type that I am tied to in the spot market. I think that's really for the smallest players what they need to be doing.
Absolutely. I'm going to do one more question, then we'll get into lightning round questions quick, but I am curious. So what's, just looking at where we're at, is there any trend or shift in the trucking industry that people might not be paying enough attention to yet?
They probably are paying, because this is sort of the buzziest word. I mean, every generation has its buzzword. The one now is AI, right? Artificial intelligence. But it's not just sort of like, look at all these things artificial intelligence can do. Artificial intelligence is driving the economy and the freight economy. And the reason I say that is this: if you look at industrial production, you look at especially non-residential construction. Let's just take non-residential construction. If it weren't for investments in data centers and investments in manufacturing facilities to make semiconductors, that segment of the economy would be tanking. Those two things have really propped things up. Now, the investment in manufacturing facilities for semiconductors is starting to come down, but it's very high. But more broadly, there is a freight component to this investment, and it is very much at the forefront of what's going on, I think, in freight. And now the actual product, of course, doesn't produce a lot of freight, right? Things that are digitized, things that the chips and things like that, that's not going to produce a whole lot of freight. But the construction of the data centers, oh my gosh, that definitely is producing a lot of freight. Now, what you have to pay attention to is right now that trend line is continuing to go up. When that one starts to level off, and it will some point, we don't know when, that's when I would start looking to, okay, I need to start diversifying. I need to start looking. Now, again, I'm speaking specifically to flatbed carriers right now, but I mean, whatever your area. And the other, so that's one. And the other one is pharmaceuticals. You look at spending on non-durable goods, and it's been rising, modestly. But if you take pharmaceuticals out of it, no, it's not. And, you take computers out of, consumer spending on durable goods, it's not growing either. And so what people have to understand is there is a lot of things that are driving our economic growth that are not producing a lot of freight. And I think that's been a large part of what has been going on over the past 2 to 3 years in the industry. Why have we been in this freight rate recession that has lasted so long? Well, one is we built up way too much capacity in 2022. But the other one is that even though the overall metrics for the economy have been either stable or growing, when you dig down and look at what's driving those, it's not stuff that produces freight. And I think that's the thing. I'm sad to say that. I mean, that's kind of not a very encouraging thing. But I will say that, as I pointed out earlier, manufacturing is in the recovery phase, and manufacturing is certainly, I think, part of why rates in the spot market, in dry van and flatbed have been so strong, over the last three to 4 months at this point.
I'll start a lightning question. We ask these questions to all of our guests that come on. I'm not going to start with the real fun one about the animals. I'll kind of pivot here, and I'll ask you if you could instantly fix or change one problem the trucking industry has, what would that be?
Well, okay, this kind of alludes to my point earlier about they have to be able to breathe. Is that I would instill in every single operator, or I would even broaden that to stakeholder, broker, carrier, shipper, a basic understanding of economics. Because I think that's really, I think there are too many people out there who don't understand that they're losing money every time they do something, and that hurts everybody, right? Because, if you are undercutting the market because you are making dumb decisions, this is especially true. I mean, this has always been true. I think it's especially true, though, over the last 5 years, because you built up such a large cadre of very small operations that has still been very resilient. That's come down from the peak, in late 2022, but it's still, we still have more carriers in the market. 33% more carriers in the market than we had before the pandemic. That is not where the trend line would have taken us. My point being that, all of that capacity gets aggregated, by intermediaries, and it does have an effect on the market. It's not, there's nobody to blame. That's just a reality of market dynamics, but it happens because, people are not understanding that, I need to charge more for this, or I'm not really maximizing my profit. And I think, to even go a step further, I would say, understanding that profit is more important than growth. That would be kind of the corollary there, is understanding that, it doesn't help me to double the size of my fleet if I'm losing, a little bit on every single load,
All too true. Or that at some point in the market shift is not going to be profitable as well. There's often that grow and not the long-term profit. A few more, but what's a book, podcast, or newsletter that you recommend to people in freight? Besides FTR, Truckstop, Spot Market Insight newsletter.
I was going to say that because I couldn't think of another. So, the one that I like to see it's probably the first thing I read every day is the Wall Street Journal's logistics report. And, it's available for free. You don't have to be a Wall Street Journal subscriber to get it. But it's a good distillation of kind of the key stuff. And they put at the end, they basically put little headlines linking you to, any number of sources. And, I would say you can get a good briefing every day just reading those headlines and okay, I get an okay sense of what's going on. So that would be the one I would pick probably. If I can't pick Trucking Market Update, which is launched every Tuesday, and available through your favorite platform.
All right, this is going to be probably the most important question that you've been asked so far on the show, and it is, if animals could drive trucks, which animal do you think would be the best driver?
Animals could drive trucks, so my inclination would be to pick, who's the most aware or alert animal, but that kind of applies to any animal that's low on the food chain because they're having to. So I'm going to have to go with something practical, which is it's got to be a primate because they've got to be able to grab the steering wheel. So I'm going to go with a chimpanzee, which I think is probably the least interesting answer you'll ever get to that question, but that's me. That's my sort of practical side, I guess.
Yeah, the problem with the chimpanzee, they'd be monkeying around the whole time.
Yeah, that's
just kidding.
How's that any different anyway? I'm just kidding.
Oh man!
Send your letters to Todd and John. Not to
I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry for that.
Avery, this has been so awesome. One thing to call out and shout out, Avery is going to be a regular guest with us, and we're going to, dive in, not near to this extent, and we just wanted to give a good overview of Avery and the FTR and Truckstop relationship, but he's going to join us regularly, probably monthly, to talk about market and updates and things like that. But this has been great. I really appreciate it, Avery. John?
Yeah, agreed. It's been a lot of fun. Really appreciate you jumping on with us. Just a key takeaway from me is, what I gathered, or my one sentence is, take a step back, look at the broader data. The market data that is provided is to be used as kind of a guidepost, but make sure you're doing your due diligence around really understanding the data when you're looking at it. So
yeah. Absolutely.
And Avery, any last words or where people can find more from you? You mentioned a few things.
Well, actually, you can find Spot Market Insights specifically at spot.ftrintel.com. And then if you actually go to ftrintel.com, you can find links to a bunch of other resources, many of which are, complimentary, including, link to my podcast, but also a number of other things that we provide periodically, as a service to the industry. Spot.ftrintel.com. That would be where I'd go first.
Awesome. It has been an honor. Thank you for being with us today.
Thank you. I've enjoyed it.
Bye, Avery.
If today's episode helped you think differently about your operation, share it with someone in your network who needs to hear it.
And if you're looking for tools to help keep your truck rolling, from finding quality loads, getting paid quicker, well, Truckstop.com is here to help.
Go visit Truckstop.com to explore the load board, rate insights, and risk management solutions built specifically for carriers and brokers.
Thanks for listening to us at Behind the Freight.
Until next time, keep the wheels turning and the bad loads burning.